Before the music industry learned how to market youth, before teenage idols became a business model, there was a voice that sounded too young to be real. It came out of Harlem. High, pure, almost fragile. A voice that made adults pause and made teenagers feel seen for the very first time. In the mid-1950 seconds, America was still divided by race, by fear, by rules that said who could stand where and who could dance with whom. And yet, through small radios and black and white television screens, that voice crossed every line. His name was Frankie Lymon. He was barely a teenager when his song reached the top of the charts, not just in the United States, but across the ocean. He didn't sing about rebellion. He sang about love, the kind young people felt but had never heard spoken out loud. For a brief moment, it felt like the world was opening its arms. But success came faster than protection. Fame arrived before guidance, and the system that lifted him up had no plan to keep him safe. His rise lasted less than 2 years. His influence lasted generations, and when he was found dead at just 25 years old, the music world was left with a question it still hasn't fully answered. How does someone who gave so much joy disappear so quietly? He was born in Harlem, New York, in 1942, at a time when opportunity was unevenly distributed and childhood often ended early. Frankie Lymon grew up in a working-class household where survival came before dreams. His mother worked as a domestic maid. His father drove trucks. Both parents sang gospel music, and the sound of harmony filled the home long before fame ever came calling. Music wasn't introduced to him, it surrounded him. As a child, Frankie sang with his brothers in church groups and neighborhood ensembles. His voice stood out almost immediately, not because it was loud, but because it was clear. There was something arresting about how young it sounded and how confidently he carried it. But life outside of music was unforgiving. When his parents separated, the family struggled financially. Frankie went to work at a grocery store at a very young age, running the register and delivering packages just to help keep food on the table. While other kids played stickball in the streets, he learned responsibility and exposure to adult realities came far too soon. Harlem in the early 1950 seconds was alive with sound, on street corners and in building hallways. Teenage vocal groups practiced harmonies night after night. Singing was affordable, it was communal, and for many kids, it was a way out. One of those neighborhood groups was called the Coups de Villes. Frankie admired them deeply. He followed them, listened closely, and begged for a chance to sing alongside them. At first, he was too young, too small, easy to overlook. But talent has a way of insisting. After watching him perform at a school talent show, the group finally gave in. They changed names first to the Ermines, then later to the Premiers, and Frankie became the youngest member. What he lacked in age, he made up for in presence. Even then, people noticed how comfortable he seemed performing, how naturally he commanded attention. Night after night, the group rehearsed on street corners until neighbors called the police. Their harmonies carried through open windows, echoing through Harlem's brick corridors. It was during one of those nights that chance intervened. Richard Barrett, a singer and songwriter already working in the music industry, heard them. He recognized something special, not just in the group, but in the small boy standing at the center of the sound. That moment changed everything. Soon, Frankie would step out of Harlem and onto a stage far larger than anyone had imagined. But before the world learned his name, he was just a kid with a voice, standing on a street corner, believing that singing might save him. When opportunity finally arrived, it didn't knock gently. It came through Richard Barrett, a songwriter and performer who understood the machinery of the music business. After hearing the group rehearse, he brought them into a recording world that was still learning how to handle young black talent. At the label, executives saw something immediately. Not just a group, a centerpiece. Frankie Lymon was barely 13, but his presence shifted the room. His voice cut through harmonies with a clarity that felt effortless. There was confidence there, energy, a kind of joy that couldn't be taught. The group was renamed the the spotlight narrowed. Frankie became the lead. From a collection of old love letters and poems came a melody that would soon circle the globe. Why Do Fools Fall in Love wasn't loud or rebellious. It was innocent, honest, and that was exactly why it worked. Released in early 1956, the song exploded. It topped the R&B charts, crossed over to the pop charts, and then did something unprecedented. It reached #1 in the United Kingdom. For the first time, a teenage black voice from Harlem was being played everywhere. Schools, radios, living rooms, television screens. Teenagers finally heard themselves reflected back through music. They dressed like Frankie, sang like Frankie, moved like Frankie. Matching outfits and group harmonies became the blueprint for what youth culture would look like next. But with fame came exposure, and with exposure came resistance. While touring across the United States, especially in the South, the group faced open segregation. White performers stayed in proper hotels. Black musicians were sent elsewhere. Meals were ordered for them because they weren't allowed inside restaurants. Outside venues, protest signs warned of outside influence and racial fear. And then came July 1957. On a live national television broadcast, Frankie stepped off the stage and danced with a white teenage girl in the audience. It lasted only seconds, but the reaction was immediate. Sponsors pulled out, complaints flooded in. The show was canceled. Rock and roll had crossed the line and America wasn't ready. Still, the momentum continued. Hit records followed. Tours expanded. Movie appearances cemented their image. For a brief window, Frankie Lymon and his group were everywhere at once. But behind the scenes, decisions were already being made. Contracts were rewritten. Royalties were unclear. And plans were forming to separate the boy from the group that had risen with him. At the height of his fame, the foundation beneath Frankie's success was already cracking. The world saw a star. The industry saw a product, and neither stopped to ask what would happen when the voice finally changed. The voice that once sounded timeless did what all young voices eventually do. It changed. As adolescence set in, Frankie Lymon no longer sounded like the boy America had fallen in love with. The industry, however, had already made its decision. The solution wasn't to slow down or protect him, it was to separate him. Management pushed for a solo career. The group that had carried the sound together was quietly dismantled. Contracts shifted, promises were made, and the teenagers were left behind after barely a year and a half together. Behind the scenes, money told a different story than the applause did. Frankie and the other members were paid small weekly allowances while being told the rest was placed into trust funds waiting for them when they turned 21. They performed hundreds of shows, appeared on television, and sold records by the millions. Years later, when the accounts were finally checked, the trust funds held almost nothing. By then, the damage was already done. As a solo artist, Frankie still appeared on major stages. He earned strong performance fees, but without the group, audiences felt the absence, and venues paid less when the teenagers weren't there. The momentum slowed, the spotlight dimmed, and loneliness crept in. Away from school, away from friends his own age, Frankie was surrounded by adults who treated excess as normal. Drugs were common. Temptation was constant. At just 15, he was introduced to heroin, a decision he would later describe as curiosity mixed with pressure, not intention. Addiction took hold quietly. He tried to stop more than once. Rehab followed relapse. Loss followed loss. When his mother died, the anchor he had left disappeared, and the drugs returned with more force. Desperation led to one of the most tragic decisions of his life. Needing money, Frankie sold his publishing rights for a fraction of their value. The songs that once promised security were no longer his to protect. Record labels came and went. Contracts were signed and broken. Performances became inconsistent. Arrests followed for theft, for possession, not because he was violent, but because addiction demands payment. A judge offered him a chance instead of prison, rehabilitation, and military service. For a time, it worked. Frankie stayed clean. He married. He attended church. He sang again on weekends, trying to rebuild what had been lost. But structure couldn't undo years of damage. When he left the military under disciplinary discharge, the industry welcomed him back cautiously, if at all. He wanted a comeback. He believed there was still time. What no one around him seemed prepared to face was this simple truth. Frankie Lymon had been famous before he was protected, and by the time he needed saving, the business had already moved on. To understand what happened to Frankie Lymon, you have to look beyond the individual and examine the system that surrounded him. In 1,950 seconds, America, Black artists were welcomed for their talent, but rarely protected for their humanity. Touring the country meant confronting segregation at every stop. White performers slept in proper hotels. Black musicians were often sent elsewhere. Meals were ordered for them because they weren't allowed to sit inside restaurants. These weren't inconveniences. They were reminders of where the country drew its lines. Internationally, the response was different. In the United Kingdom and across Europe, the music arrived before the politics. Audiences embraced the sound without fully understanding the weight it carried in America. To them, it was joy. To America, it was change arriving too fast. That difference mattered. At home, the industry operated on control. Publishing rights, songwriting credits, and royalties were rarely explained to young performers, especially minors. Decisions were made in rooms they weren't allowed to enter, using contracts they weren't old enough to understand. When Frankie's career declined, his catalog did not. The value of his recordings increased as his ability to perform decreased. That imbalance fueled suspicion after his death, not because evidence proved wrongdoing, but because history had already taught people how often Black artists were exploited. Officially, Frankie died of a heroin overdose in 1968. That is the record. But records don't always quiet questions. Rumors followed because there were financial incentives attached to his music, and because those incentives outlived him. Decades later, legal battles over royalties would resurface, triggered by new generations rediscovering his work. When Why Do Fools Fall in Love returned to the charts in the 1,980 seconds, it reopened old wounds about ownership and recognition questions that should have been answered while he was alive. From a global perspective, Frankie Lymon became a cautionary figure, not just a teenage star who fell too fast, but an example of what happens when talent outruns protection. The world remembers the voice. America must remember the cost. In the end, there was no grand farewell. On a winter day in 1968, Frankie Lymon was found alone in a bathroom far removed from the stages that once defined him. The official cause was overdose. The headlines were brief. The world moved on. But music rarely does. Years passed, and his voice kept finding new ears. New generations discovered the same innocence, the same urgency, the same impossible youth frozen in sound. Artists who came after him cited him as influence. His songs returned to the charts. His name reappeared in courtrooms, not because of unfinished fame, but because of unfinished business. Recognition arrived late, but it arrived. Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. His name was added to the Hollywood Walk of Fame. A film retold his story, imperfect but necessary, reminding audiences that behind every myth is a human life shaped by choices, systems, and timing. For years, Even his grave stood without a marker. That absence spoke volumes. It reflected how easily pioneers are celebrated in sound, yet neglected in memory. How quickly the industry benefits from innovation while distancing itself from responsibility. Frankie didn't live long enough to manage his legacy, but the legacy managed to survive without him. Today, his story is no longer just about tragedy. It's about warning, about care, about what happens when talent is discovered before protection is in place. He was not the first young artist to rise too fast, but he was among the first to show the cost. If this story made you think about someone whose voice shaped your youth, someone whose life didn't get the ending it deserved, share their name. These stories stay alive because people keep telling them. And if you believe music history should remember its pioneers, not just for what they created, but for what they endured, consider staying with us. There are many more stories still waiting to be told. Frankie Lymon didn't disappear. He echoes